Some things in economics um, correlate with each other. So this is my Pocket Book of Knowledge series where I will find parts of our syllabus and try and simplify them. Well, first thing we do, define indirect tax. What prior knowledge do we need? Well, indirect tax will cause a shift in the supply curve inwards, and we need to know the theory of consumer surplus and producer surplus. Anything above the triangle made when we get equilibrium price is consumer surplus, and producer surplus is the triangle below the equilibrium price, and together they form community surplus. But this you will have to go back and check if you do not know. The diagram will speak to us, but can only speak when I understand the language. Many times in life, if I went to Russia, the road signs would be of no use to me, unless somebody could explain what they meant. Obviously, certain of arrows pointing in certain directions may seem like they make sense to us. But let me put it simply. When I traveled through France, I wanted to get to a ferry, and I also wanted to avoid the toll routes. I knew and had been told that toll routes were expensive in France. Now, while this was beautifully signposts on the freeway, I could not understand the language. So to utilize the diagram, you must know the theory. To apply the theory and diagram, you must know how to do this. In an answer, you must be explicitly explaining how to do this. Theory is not always fact. Theory is not reality. Theory is, however, necessary. Now, the diagram shows nothing to those who don't understand what it is about, just as the beautiful sign in France meant nothing to me until I had made the mistake. I am yet to find some musical interlude or some typing of tin or something like that. So yes. It is good to learn the diagram, but it is better to build the diagram. So, indirect tax diagram. How do I build it? Well, I start with supply and demand in equilibrium at P1, Q1. I suitably label the axes price and quantity. I add a S-curve to the left of the original S-curve and call it S+tax. At the new points of intersection, I label P2 and Q2. The diagram is simple. The diagram is elegant. It has been said that we cannot avoid death or taxes. Seeing is believing. As you can see, I have price on the y-axis. I have quantity on the x-axis. Initially, I had a supply and demand curve. The supply curve has shifted into S+tax. So, summed up, diagram number 1, an indirect tax has been applied, shifting S to S+tax. So simple, so elegant. How could it go wrong? Where could it go wrong? How can we simplify further? In economics, if you look at a small piece of knowledge, it's very understandable. It is bringing things together. How can we do this? Well, as you see here, I have lost the label of my S+tax diagram, but we know this. So you will observe that tax causes quantity demanded to fall from Q1 to Q2 due to the law of demand. And you will observe that the price has risen from P1 to P2. Notice I have applied this diagram. I have explicitly told you what is happening. On this diagram, you will observe the tax burden. Apply this in explanation or by shading or otherwise identifying. So, as you can see, when the S has shifted inwards to S plus tax, we have a tax burden. For the consumer, the burden is P2, A, C, P1. That area you could shade. For the producer, that burden is P1, C, B, D. This tax burden is because that area once belonged to community surplus, but now has to be paid over to the government as tax revenue. For higher levels, the demand curve could be steeper, and that would push the tax burden onto the shoulders of the consumers. Tax could be used as a Pigovian tax to basically try and make people smoke less of cigarettes due to a rise in price. Well, I'm feeling happier. How about you? We have learned that a tax diagram is very simple to apply. We shift our supply curve inwards to S plus tax. Then we look at our points of intersection and we take them down to the respective axis. Then all we must do is explain and apply our theory. Okay, so it looks very beautiful. You notice though I had to put a beautiful design on, and that did bite into my diagram. So let's have a little reminder there. The supply curve, original supply curve S, shifted inwards as denoted by the arrow to S plus tax. Now this caused the quantity demanded to drop from Q1 to Q2, yeah, and thus you can see we have lost a triangle of community surplus denoted by AEB. That is gone. This has reduced the producer revenue. Actually, producer revenue is reduced by by two rectangles, CEQ1 Q2 and P1 CBD. As in, it has lost the ability to sell quantity 1 and must give over as part of its tax burden P1 CBD. The consumer has lost part of its consumer surplus ACE and must also shoulder part of the tax that goes to the government. Basically, in simple English, the consumer is paying more for less quantity. The government will earn tax revenue P2ABD. For the government, the indirect tax is gained. For community surplus, a deadweight loss of AEB is experienced. For the consumer, they pay more for less. For the producer, they sell less and must pay over in tax, and thus will have less producer revenue. I now know how to build the indirect tax diagram. I know the effect on consumer. I know the effect on government. I know the effect on producer. I have three stakeholders in the economy. This is explanation, a AO2 skill. In questions, I may be asked to evaluate. Then I would use the knowledge of the diagram, but know that the diagram is not reality. Is a tax always good? Can I stop people smoking by raising a tax? What effect would tax have in the short run? What effect would tax have in the long run? What are the effects on stakeholders beyond producer, consumer, and government? What are the advantages? What are the disadvantages? That, though, is up to you. Do you know how to apply the indirect tax diagram?